Hi, my name is Shelly Christensen. Thanks for joining me for this Community for All conference workshop, Belonging in Action. I'm very glad you're here. I'm the mom of three sons. When one of our boys was diagnosed with ADHD and subsequently with an autism spectrum disorder, I chose to educate myself about the legal rights he had to his education, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA. My decision to learn about IDEA came after many failed attempts to communicate with public school officials and teachers who always thought they knew what was best for our son without really knowing him. They didn't see his strengths or understand his way of adapting to transitions between classes and so much more. They only thought how rude he was when he cracked a book open and read for 5 minutes at the beginning of every class. It was his way of calming himself and navigating transitions from one class to another. And the other thing is they never minced words when it came to talking about how inconsistent his homework completion was. During one call, I asked his teacher how he could possibly move from one unit to the next in math if he wasn't turning in his homework, which, by the way, was earning him a D. Oh, the teacher explained, he'll move on. He's getting 95 to 100% on all his tests. Aha, he was learning in his way. I was exhausted going into all these battles with teachers. The Mrs. Christensen calls from school principals and teachers were frequent, and they included a litany of negative remarks and reports about our son. But the day the school principal called and threatened to put our son in school suspension that day for poking a hole in a concrete wall with a pencil, that was the day I threatened to lawyer up. The only place where we never had to advocate for our son was our synagogue religious school. He was a valued member of his class, and instead of putting up obstacles to his learning, his teachers all learned what his strengths and interests were and used those to teach him. Our entire family felt accepted, and our synagogue home was a place just to be us. This was where our whole family participated in all the things that mattered to us, fulfilling our dream of lifelong education in our faith tradition, making friends both for our kids and for us, and volunteering, finding other people with common interests, and of course, worshiping in community. Our experiences, as well as the experiences of many others who have found a sense of belonging in their own faith communities, is why I'm so passionate about belonging, and it's why I work in this field of faith community disability and mental health inclusion. So in this workshop, we're going to do three things. We're going to look at what a culture of belonging is as faith communities seek to be inclusive. And we'll look at where to start as we shift our communal mindset to belonging. We'll also look at several practical ways to encourage belonging through the actions we can take. Each section will include 2 questions for you to ponder. So whether you're watching on your own or in a group, you can pause the video to contemplate the questions, write down your thoughts, and even have a group conversation on Zoom. A sense of belonging. Why are we focused on belonging now? What happened to inclusion? Well, inclusion is still important. Think of it this way. Belonging is our why. Inclusion is our how. Belonging is universal. It asserts that every human being is created in the divine image. Inclusion has been in our vocabulary for several decades and even more in some faith-based organizations. The word inclusion itself has become a catch-all for any type of programs that people with disabilities or mental health conditions could attend. For example, Many congregations would hold a special inclusion Sabbath where people with disabilities were invited to attend. I recall one such service in my own synagogue where people were invited to attend and stay for dinner. They were members of a group of adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities. After the lovely service, I sat with a man, Tom was his name. Tom used a power wheelchair and he didn't speak. So Tom sat with me and his caregiver joined us. I had noticed Tom's face light up during the service, and although he didn't speak, I asked him if he'd like to come to services more often. And again, his eyes lit up. I explained to him and to his caregiver how to find out when services were being held and who to contact to make accommodation requests if needed. So think about this. When people who attend in groups or even as individuals are invited back or asked what they want in their spiritual and religious life, that opens the doorway to creating a sense of belonging. Further, a sense of belonging is what most of us want. When we belong, people know our names. They notice when we're not there and when we are there. Belonging is the heartbeat of inclusion. It expresses an openness to see each person as a creation of the Holy One, and it's the foundation to any type of community. So here's our food for thought. What gives you a sense of belonging to your faith community? What are those things that are part of your faith community life that you just treasure? And now imagine that these ways that you feel a sense of belonging are not there. Think about how your life might be different. We're going to find a starting point. And this is actually very practical. It's how we get to the information we need to make belonging as personal as possible because belonging is personal. Getting to that state of belonging is to infuse that sense into all aspects of a faith community. And belonging is the response to our individual expressions of what's important to us and how we want to belong. Think about your role in your own faith community as we continue. So, no matter what that is, professional, laity, volunteer, teacher, person living with a disability or mental health condition, and allies, keep that in mind as you go through this. No one is a single story. Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie is a writer who gave the TED Talk, The Danger of a Single Story. She said, "The consequence of the single story is this: it robs people of dignity. It makes our recognition of our equal humanity difficult, and it emphasizes how we are different rather than how we are similar." So imagine each one of us appears as a single story to someone else. It's the story that's visible to others. It's a first glance or an assumption that we might make about a person based on just a tiny bit of information. But our other stories, who we are and who we've been, the people we love, the things we've done in our lives, the stumbles, yes, and the triumphs too, and the hopes and the dreams, those are our real stories. When we get to know someone, we learn their stories and they learn ours. We build friendships and we build relationships. This is the hallmark of belonging. Yet, people with disabilities and mental health conditions across the lifespan are often known only by their diagnosis or by their behavior. When we start to learn each other's stories, that's where the change really happens. Many faith communities embrace this phrase from the book of Isaiah, chapter 56, verse 7. For my house shall be called the house of prayer for all peoples. Embrace it as the expression of inclusiveness. When I look at this, I see this as an aspiration, as something we can be, something we want to be. It really is the beginning of this verse, though, that provides the sacred mandate to include all people in a house of prayer. I will bring them to my holy mount, and I will cause them to rejoice in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and their sacrifices shall be acceptable upon my altar. For my house shall be called a house of prayer for all peoples. In the Holy One's eyes, every one of us has something to contribute. God brings us to that holy mount to accept our gifts. We rejoice together in that sacred space, in joy, in holiness, as God's partners. And everyone belongs. That's what makes a house of prayer for all peoples. The emphasis is on individuals, not on organizations. Inclusion is not about programs, it's about people. So we're going to turn now to the role of faith-based organizations. And that role is, one of those roles is to support people to live involved and engaged lives based on their own preferences, interests, and choices. We do this for people without disabilities. It's time for people with disabilities and mental health conditions to give voice to what is important to them. When we don't engage in communicating with each other, we limit the ways people can participate and never find out what those ways are that are important to them. We also don't learn about people's unique interests, their gifts, and their strengths. We still consider people with disabilities and mental health conditions to be the other. And that creates a distinction that we know as them and us. But we can do so much more when we focus on bringing the spirit of belonging into practice. Just ask, just listen, just learn. One of our sons is a big fan of the author Terry Pratchett. As I was preparing this program, he happened to show me a quotation from Terry Pratchett's New York Times best-selling book, Pyramids. And I thought that it really resonated with what we're learning and talking about today. The role of listeners has never been fully appreciated. However, it is well known that most people don't listen. They use the time when someone else is speaking to think about what they're going to say next. True listeners have always been revered among oral culture and prized for their rarity value. Bards and poets are 10 a cow, but a good listener is hard to find, or at least hard to find twice. Supporting a sense of belonging is about listening, really listening to someone's story, asking questions to begin a dialogue, not an interview, by the way, leads to important discoveries and common threads. As you begin to think about what the conversation with someone who wants to belong to your faith community looks like, I want to stress the need to really listen once more. The biggest communication problem is that we do not listen to understand, we listen to reply. To construct a plan for participation in a faith community without asking the individual to share what is important to them or really listening to that demonstrates a lack of respect and thrusts that person back into the role of the other. Some of the people that you may meet may not be fully aware of the many ways to contribute their own gifts and strengths to the community. Discovering these with someone can be filled with moments of grace. And these are some conversation starters. Many can be adapted for children and teens. And these are also important to engage with parents of younger children. If parents of caregivers of adults are present, or if the person uses an interpreter, make sure to have the conversation with the individual because this is the person who wants to belong. Some of these questions may lead to other questions or streams of conversation. These are not written in stone. Tell me about yourself is a good icebreaker. And just listen instead of trying to problem solve. Make this a dialogue. Share your story too. If you would like a copy of these questions, feel free to contact me at the email address on your screen. And also, these questions are contained in my book, From Longing to Belonging. One of my, I think, most powerful conversations often starts with, tell me about your faith journey. Tell me about how you celebrated the holidays. Those are such great opportunities to have a conversation because in that conversation, the two people who are engaged can tell their stories. And it really is a very strong connector, as I'm sure you've experienced in your own life as well. So let's go on to our food for thought here. And this is for you. Think about a time when you were new to your faith community. How did you reach out to participate or connect to something you were interested in? Did you have some support to make the connections or get to where you wanted to be? And think about what questions you're comfortable answering as you get to know someone. So when you're having that conversation with people, make sure that you start this conversation expecting to be able to share your own story as well. Just be comfortable. We're going to move on to our third part of this presentation, belonging in action. I've listed just some of the ways that people want to belong. Some of these, by the way, are maybe not customary in your faith community. And the whole point of belonging is to ensure that anybody that wants to participate in any of the activities you offer is able to do so. So, looking at religious services and participation in rituals and attending Bible study. Think about religious education, and this is across the lifespan from preschool to the oldest adults in your community. What does this look like? How are people included? Social groups. And this is important too, because so much of these are interest-based. And there's also gender-based programs and other things. But think about book clubs and different groups who are doing wine tastings or any of those things that you've developed, especially over the course of the last year, where it's easier for people to get to. Look at volunteering opportunities. And one of the things that we don't often think of are leadership opportunities. What I like to say is that people with disabilities and mental health conditions should be included in the classroom, the sanctuary, and the boardroom. Some of the most outstanding members in leadership maybe weren't considered to be part of that until the conversations happened, until belonging became important. Before the pandemic, we used to talk about the stumbling blocks to belonging and participation. And what did those include? There were physical stumbling blocks, lack of building access or access in the building for people using mobility devices, We would suggest putting higher intensity light bulbs in so people could see the materials, visual prayer, many different kinds of things that we wanted to consider. And now with Zoom, we may have different ways of creating access and removing those stumbling blocks, but they are just as important. And so I'm going to suggest, as I've always suggested, to include an accommodation statement in all of the material that goes out to people in your community. If you require an accommodation in order to participate, please contact us. Include a person's name and their email address and phone number for who to contact. And I know that we have done a lot to bring ourselves to sort of a now comfortable place on Zoom. But I want you to just remember these things. Everything that you do should be captioned. And if you don't have access to captioning, a live captioning, you can check out different programs. Rev.com is the one that I know of the most, but there are others that will caption in real time. People may request an ASL interpreter. Somebody may want audio descriptions. And as far as accessible materials, you can always link to their home page, to a PDF of a prayer book, for example. Link it in the chat so people can click there and go right to that document. Put it on your website. Send the links to the materials out whenever you send an email with the Zoom links for upcoming programs. So people can print them out if they'd like, or put them on screen readers. So whatever that is. And again, another important aspect that we've had to deal with is, what about people who don't have access to either the equipment or the website or the internet? And a lot of people have been donating computers and tablets and iPads and so forth. And that's great. But the biggest concern is not having internet access. And some communities have been purchasing internet access for people so that they can use that whenever they feel they need it. So these are just some important things to think about, and they're not all inclusive, but they are really important in terms of access. So the takeaway from here, use that accommodation statement and make sure you follow up with people, find out, make sure that they have access. And then when we return in person at some point in the future, you're going to notice that maybe there are more people in your pews or attending events than ever before because they've been introduced to your organization, your faith-based organization, through Zoom and through the pandemic. So again, let's be thinking about ways to invite people to tell you what they need in order to participate. Our last food for thought. Name something that you will do to build on the culture of inclusion and belonging. And then think about some of the things we talked about today. What stood out to you? What do you want to reflect on and share with your faith community? This is my book, From Longing to Belonging, a practical guide to including people with disabilities and mental health conditions in your faith community, and my address and my website at inclusioninnovations.com. We all want to belong. The portal to a spiritual or religious community life doesn't have two entrances. Nope. Not one for people without disabilities who get to decide what they do, and another for people who are seen by others as unable to make decisions about how they want to participate because they live with a disability or a mental health diagnosis. or they have a different way of moving, speaking, hearing, seeing, thinking, or any other way of being in the world, there is only one portal to faith community life. It's the one that's marked for all who are created in the image of God. And on that portal, on that door, is written the word welcome. Thank you so much for joining me today. And I wish you blessings and much success